I spent 2 years of my microblading career working way too deep, and I was getting hit and miss results. I was yearning to know what is the actual proper depth and pressure to use when microblading. It wasn't until I actually took my 3rd training that I learned. So I was a microblading artist with 2 years experience at the time, but my initial training, the only direction we got was to look for pinpoint bleeding. So a little unclear. Some of my clients, they would bleed excessively, and I did not know what the proper amount of pressure even looked like. I had never actually seen another artist perform microblading in front of my eyes, except for like the extremely bloody videos on YouTube that I was seeing at the time. So that's when I took my 3rd training, and I sat there in the room with 20 other artists, and I had the burning question inside me: how much pressure do you use when microblading? So I eagerly raised my hand during the question period and I asked. The trainer's response super surprised me, and she was like, "Oh, it's easy." I was like, "What?" So she said, "It's easy. Just take a food scale and measure 20 grams of pressure for the head, 15 grams of pressure for the body, and just 10 grams of pressure for the tail." That night, I took up my food scale and I tested it out. So I first started by pressing down with my usual pressure that I did, and I was using 100 grams of pressure, so way too much. I practiced with the new prescribed pressures until I was hitting them consistently. And then when I applied this to my clients, I actually started seeing more consistently better healed results with my clients since that training, which was amazing. So this is now how I perform microblading, but I have added some additional guidance, which I'm gonna take you through right now. How to measure your depth and pressure. What you'll need. You're gonna need a food scale that measures in grams, and you'll need a pen or the back end of your microblading handle. What we're gonna do is we're gonna take the back end of the pen or the microblading handle and rest our pinky next to the scale so our hand weight is not added onto the scale. We're going to use different pressures for the head, the body, and the tail because the skin changes in thickness as we move across the brow. The skin at the heads is going to be the thickest, and the tails and the arches are so delicately thin. If we use the same pressure, we would risk scarring the skin and will most likely get a blowout or a dark ashy stroke. Let's start by pressing down with as much pressure as you're currently using with microblading. The amount may surprise you, and that's okay. I was doing 100 grams of pressure, and I have had students press down and they hit 300 grams. So where you're at, it's okay, as long as you now commit towards getting better and doing it properly. If you did this food scale test, comment below with the pressure that you're currently using with microblading. No judgment here. So next, let's try the prescribed pressure. Press down with 20 grams of pressure. This is the pressure we want to use at the head or the beginning of the brow. You'll want to actually hit between 15 and 25 grams because it's actually very difficult to get 20 grams dead on every single time. Perfect. So next, now let's try doing an actual microblading hand motion by dragging the tool across the scale while maintaining consistent pressure between the range of 15 to 25 grams. Ideally, you do want to hit the 20 grams as much as possible, but the range is okay. So you might notice your hand pressure, it's gonna increase as you swing the tool towards you. This is because it's creating a pendulum effect, which we do wanna minimize. So keep practicing until you hit within that range consistently. Perfect. So now let's try 15 grams of pressure. This is how much pressure you're going to use for the body of the brow. So that's the middle. Practice dragging the pen or the tool across the food scale and maintain that 15 gram pressure. We can use a range again because it's very hard to hit 15 dead on. So your range will be between 10 and 20 grams because we want to stay right around that 15 gram mark. Perfect, so let's move on to the last pressure, which is 10 grams. This is so light that we're almost using absolutely no pressure at all, but it's more the weight of the hand tool that you use when you microblade if you're using a metal tool. So try dragging the tool across the scale and maintain a 5 to 15 gram range, as close to 10 grams as you can. Okay, perfect, so you've just performed the pressure for an average eyebrow. But what if the client's skin is thick and what if the client's skin is thin? Don't worry, I have you covered. The prescribed pressure is a good starting point, but different skin thicknesses, they require different prescribed pressures. The other ranges we need to account for are thin skin and thick skin. Let's start with thin skin. With thin skin, the best approach is to be very conservative. The pressures that we want to use are actually 10 grams across the board. So that means 10 grams for the head, 10 grams for the body, and 10 grams for the tail. If you're working on a thin skin and you notice that they're not bleeding at all, like zero bleeding, then reinforce your strokes with just 10 grams of pressure to try to get to the proper depth. You will know that you're there when you see blood slowly popping up in dots or in a line roughly about 5 to 10 seconds after making the stroke. If bleeding happens instantaneously, even just on one stroke, as you move across the brow, then lighten up your pressure even more as you still might be too deep. P.S. A note on bleeding. I perform my microblading dry or bare with no pigment on the blade. This allows me to see the channel I've made and the level of bleeding that it shows. If I were to perform my microblading with pigment on the blade, I wouldn't be able to see if I'm at the right depth. I go more into detail on how to perform bare or dry microblading in another video, so check that out. Now, what about for thick skin? For thick skin, I actually would still start with the prescribed 20-15-10 pressure, but I would do the first stroke at 20 grams. I would wait for 10 seconds. Sometimes I'll squeeze the stroke to stimulate the blood flow, and if I don't see any bleeding, then I reinforce that stroke with 10 grams. I wait again. If it's still not bleeding, then I do another 10-gram reinforcement pass. Once I do see the level of bleeding that I want, if I did see that after just the first pass, I'll proceed with the 20-15-10. If I did not see the level of bleeding I wanted to on the first pass and I had to go over it again, then I would increase my pressure to 40 grams for the next head stroke. Once I finish the head strokes, I'm now at the beginning of the body and I lighten up my pressure to the 15 grams. If I do not see bleeding after 10 seconds, I reinforce it until I see it. If I did see the amount of bleeding on the first pass that I wanted to see, then I will move on to the next stroke with the same 15 grams of pressure. If I did not see the level of bleeding that I wanted to, and I did have to pass over the stroke again, I will increase my pressure to about 25 grams for the next stroke and see if that single pass will give me the level of bleeding that I'm looking for. For the tails with thick skin, it can still be very, very thin. So proceed with just 10 grams of pressure again and repeat the same waiting for the blood process. If I didn't see bleeding after the first pass, I would reinforce that stroke again and try a conservative 15 to 20 grams maybe for the next stroke so that I can hit that depth on that first pass. In conclusion, depth and pressure can be confusing whether you're new or even if you've been doing this for a few years. When I'm teaching students, sometimes they're using the right amount of pressure, but the skin isn't breaking. So let's talk about troubleshooting. So if they perform a stroke and it feels smooth and there's no signature Velcro sound signaling a successful stroke, then that cut didn't actually cut the skin. If this happens to you, here are the priorities I teach my students to help you troubleshoot. So step number 1, improve your stretch. Step number 2, change the angle of your blade. Step number 3, as a last resort, increase your pressure by 5 to 10 grams. Let's take a deeper look into how to execute these priorities. Step number 1, improve your stretch. When I'm working, the last thing I do is increase my pressure. If you think about the tails or the tops of the brow, these areas actually seem really easy to get the blade in the skin and to hear that crisp, clear sound. Whereas near the head or the body of the brow, it can sometimes feel smooth there and you won't feel that texture on your blade. It's easier to stretch the top of the brow and the tail. It's more difficult to stretch the head and the body of the brow, but I have an order of priorities that I look at to help me and my students. So for stretching, there are 3 ways we can improve the stretch. Number 1, change your finger placement. Number 2, stretch tighter. Number 3, stretch smaller. So number 1, changing the finger placement. The first thing I would do is I would check my finger placement. You want 1 finger at the beginning of the stroke and 1 finger at the end of the stroke. If you miss the finger at the beginning of the stroke, the skin is going to pull with the blade and scrunch up. This is going to require you to apply more pressure to cut into the skin, which we don't want right now. So let's illustrate that. Imagine cutting into a tomato with a dull knife. The skin of the tomato, it depressed into the body, and it's only when you apply more pressure that the surface of the skin snaps and the knife plunges deep into the tomato. This is kind of what would happen if we just applied more pressure to cut the skin. It would depress the skin and apply so much pressure that when the skin does finally break, the blade plunges deeper into the skin than we want it. So don't do that. Stretch better first. You'll often hear about a 3-point stretch. I find that if you can at least have a finger at the beginning and the end of the stroke, that stretch is quite tight and in such a way that you can create a clean cut even without using your 3rd finger. Priority number 2, stretch tighter. So you might be pressing down on the skin, but you need to stretch your fingers away from each other. Keep your fingers opposing each other like a backwards magnet. You want to put all the force into stretching your fingers out wide. And priority number 3, stretch smaller. So this is after you don't need your mapping anymore. If you stretch in small areas, you will need to touch the brow, which we don't want to touch the brow outline until after you've replaced it with all your framing or your foundation strokes. To stretch smaller, you're still going to want the fingers in the correct position first. So one at the start of the stroke and one at the end. You want to bring your fingers close together so that they're just 1 to 2 centimeters apart. The closer you bring your fingers, then the less you're actually going to need to stretch the skin apart because it will just be so tight on its own. If you did all 3 of these stretching adjustments and the blade still feels smooth when gliding over the skin, then here's the next thing I look at. Step 2, change the angle of your blade. This is going to change depending on if you're using a U-blade or a slanted or curved blade. As it currently stands, U-blades are my favorite for their versatility and their ease of use. With a U-blade, you can use it on an angle or you can use it directly upright. If you're having trouble getting into the skin still after you've corrected your stretch, then angle your U-blade slightly more forward so that the needle tips are perpendicular or straight down pointing into the skin. This is going to make it easier to cut the skin because the needle tips are going to catch it more easily. However, if you're using a slanted or a curved blade, then check the angle of your blade and you should be holding it so that most of the pins are touching the skin. If you're leaning back too far and the curved of the blade is not touching the skin, then you need to tilt it forward or change the angle of it in your handpiece so that the tip of the blade is touching the skin as well as most of the other needles. P.S. Do not over tilt a curved blade or a slanted blade because you're only going to get the tip into the skin. If only the first 2 to 3 needles at the tip enter the skin, it's going to be too sharp and you're going to probably go too deep. Step number 3, if those 2 elements, the stretching tighter and changing your blade angle, did not work, only then increase your pressure by 5 to 10 grams. Once you do this, watch for your key indicator, slow, pinpoint bleeding, and keep adjusting your pressure for the section of the brow that you're working on, whether it's the head, the body, or the tail. In conclusion, it can be super confusing to know how much pressure to use when microblading, but by using a tangible, measurable practice technique like a food scale, it takes the pressure from being a vaguely subjective, just work lightly direction into something more actionable and measurable. If you like this info, give this video a like and a comment. It tells YouTube that this content is helpful, which is gonna help other people like you find this content a little bit easier. If you wanna see more helpful microblading videos like this, hug the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. Till next time, keep learning.